You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Kroger Delivery has one mission: to deliver the freshest food right to your door. That's why our drivers are pros. Our trucks are refrigerated. And when it comes to low prices, we always deliver. With $20 off your first order of $75 or more, there's no better time to get in on the action. Mission accomplished. Restrictions apply. See site for details.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 474 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, by the end of the last episode, the Federals' Red River campaign was dead in the water in Louisiana, while the Arkansas portion of the plan was also in major trouble.
Down in Louisiana, Nathaniel Banks had run into a Confederate buzzsaw in the form of Richard Taylor, and after the battles at Mansfield on April 8, 1864, and Pleasant Hill the next day on the 9th, Banks' attempt to reach Shreveport had completely run off the rails.
Meanwhile, the second federal pincer that was supposed to converge on Shreveport, Frederick Steele's force, coming down from Arkansas, had run into some supply troubles, and as a result, Steele had been forced to break off his advance and turn back, heading for Camden, Arkansas, on the Washita River, where Steele hoped to dig in and await the arrival of a wagon train full of supplies that was making its way to him from Little Rock.
On the Confederate side, Department Commander Edmund Kirby Smith had appropriated most of Dick Taylor's infantry, telling Taylor he was going to march north from Louisiana into Arkansas to link up with Sterling Price and John Marmaduke. Kirby Smith's plan was to destroy Steele, then march into Little Rock as a conquering hero.
In Arkansas, Frederick Steele reached Camden on April 16th, the same day that down in Louisiana, Kirby Smith marched out of Shreveport. By that time, Steele was desperate for supplies. Camden was a good place to dig in, but if he couldn't feed his 15,000 men, then all the earthworks in the world would be useless to him.
The next day, Steele dispatched 198 wagons out into the countryside to forage for corn or whatever other food could be acquired by any means. He sent along 2 cannon and 200 men of the 1st Kansas Cavalry colored.
The wagons and their escort moved west for about 18 miles, then scattered to forage. Most were successful in at least gathering corn from the area farms. On the morning of April 18th, the wagons and black cavalry troopers reassembled for the return to Camden. They had traveled about 4 miles when they met reinforcements, including 375 infantry and 90 cavalrymen with 2 small mountain howitzers. That meant a force of 1,000 men and 4 artillery pieces now accompanied the wagons.
On the Confederate side, Marmaduke was aware of the Federal foraging expedition and laid plans to attack the Yankees with some of his cavalry from front and flank. However, when he received word that the enemy had been reinforced, he paused and asked Sterling Price for permission to attack the wagons and their escort with his entire force of horsemen.
Price gave Marmaduke the green light, and he maneuvered his horsemen to set up a trap for the Yankees at a place called Poison Spring. By the time the Federals approached, Marmaduke had 3,100 horsemen lying in wait for them. When Marmaduke sprang his trap, Colonel James Williams of the 1st Kansas Cavalry ordered the 198 wagons to close up on one another along the road so it would be easier to protect them. He then positioned his cavalrymen to the front and along the flanks of the wagon train, with the Union infantry to the rear.
The problem for Williams was that he had to spread out the troops of the escort to try to protect the entire length of the wagon train, while the Confederates could strike wherever they chose to. The rebels struck first from the right, then from the front. The black cavalrymen broke and ran into the woods. The Confederates gave chase and cut them down.
Williams hoped that Steele and Camden would hear the sounds of battle and come to the wagon train's rescue. But the distance was a little under 11 miles as the crow flies, and no one at Camden had any idea the foraging party was in trouble, and so no help came to save the day. The Confederates captured all 198 wagons, burning 28 of them and taking the rest for their own use. They also captured all 4 of the Federal artillery pieces, plus 100 prisoners.
Marmaduke suffered 115 casualties during the fighting, while Federal losses were 301 killed, wounded, and missing, with 182 of that total coming from the 1st Kansas Cavalry. By all accounts, including those of the Confederates themselves, most of the rebels had decided not to accept the surrender of any of the black Union cavalrymen and murdered them instead.
As the survivors of the massacre at Poison Spring straggled into Camden, Frederick Steele realized that he had little choice but to remain hunkered down there, waiting for the supplies from Little Rock.
On April 18th, a courier arrived in Camden with a message saying that Banks wanted Steele to join him. Banks said he had won victories at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill, but had withdrawn to Grand Ecore to regroup and resupply.
Steele, reading between the lines, thought it curious that Banks would have to retreat to Grand Ecore after winning victories at Mansfield and Pleasant Hill. On April 22nd, Steele wrote to William Tecumseh Sherman, saying that if Banks had been defeated down in Louisiana, allowing the Confederates to now concentrate against him, that is, against Banks, then he had little chance of proceeding south and linking up with Banks.
When Steele replied to Banks, he said that he had just received word that 8,000 Confederate infantry had reinforced Sterling Price there in Arkansas, which obviously increased Steele's difficulties and lessened the chance he'd be able to join Banks. The truth of the matter was that Steele, having been forced to surrender the initiative to the Confederates due to his supply difficulties, was now hanging on at Camden by his fingernails. And so, at this point, any idea of joining Banks down in Louisiana was little more than a pipe dream.
Kirby Smith arrived at Calhoun County, Arkansas, about 20 miles east of Camden, with the 3 divisions of Confederate infantry on April 19th, and immediately took charge of field operations. He ordered James Fagan's division and Shelby's cavalry brigade to cross the Washita River and place themselves between Steele and Little Rock. Meanwhile, Parsons and Churchill were to move their divisions so as to make Steele believe the Confederates were going to launch an attack on his fortified position at Camden.
4 days later, Fagan learned that the wagon train from Little Rock that Steele was anxiously awaiting was on its way to Camden under heavy guard. Fagan headed northwest to intercept it. 45 miles of forced marching placed Fagan on the Saline River at Mount Elba, where he allowed his exhausted men to bivouac at midnight.
At dawn the next morning, April 25th, Fagan moved to Mark's Mill, located at an intersection on the road between Camden and Pine Bluff. Finding no sign of the Federal wagon train, he settled in at the crossroads and prepared to attack it when it showed up.
The wagon train, commanded by a lieutenant colonel with the swashbuckling name of Francis Drake, was rumbling southwest toward Camden from Pine Bluff. There were 240 wagons packed with rations and other supplies.
Escorting the wagons were 3 regiments of Union infantry, totaling about 1,200 men, and 240 cavalry troopers. Oddly, for a column heading potentially into harm's way, there was also a large number of camp followers and assorted hangers-on, including at least 300 escaped slaves.
The wagon train halted near Mark's Mill on the evening of April 24th, without knowing that Fagan's Confederates were just down the road a ways. Drake was so little concerned about security that he didn't even post pickets that night.
Early the next morning, after the Federals had started out, but before they reached the Saline River, Fagan hit them from the front with 2 brigades. A third, Cable's, which was hidden in the woods beside the road, hit the wagon train from the flank. For over an hour, the Federals fought fiercely, but then the arrival of Confederate reinforcements, in the form of Shelby's brigade of horsemen, tipped the battle in favor of the rebels.
Drake was wounded, and 2 of the Union infantry regiments surrendered. Shortly thereafter, the 3rd did as well. The Confederates then turned their attention to the Federal cavalry at the rear of the wagon train and drove the enemy horsemen off. During the fighting, which lasted several hours, the Yankees suffered some 1,300 casualties, mostly captured, and there were also a number of civilians killed and wounded among the camp followers and contrabands who had accompanied the wagon train.
When Frederick Steele heard about the disaster at Mark's Mill and that the Confederates had captured the wagon train full of rations and other supplies that he so desperately needed, he realized the waiting game he'd been playing was over. He had 15,000 men and 9,000 horses and mules at Camden, stranded in the middle of a countryside dominated by pine barrens and swampy bottomlands, and virtually devoid of forage. Although his subordinates offered conflicting advice about what to do next, Steele quickly reached the conclusion that the only way to save his command was to immediately abandon Camden and begin a retreat to Little Rock.
This episode is brought to you by National Geographic, presenting its new documentary film, Endurance. Follow the greatest survival story ever told, unpacking the legendary feat of polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, who kept his crew alive for over a year, despite losing their ship in frigid pack ice. Over a century later, a team of modern-day explorers set out to find the sunken ship. Endurance, now streaming on Hulu and Disney+.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See detail.
The Federals started their evacuation of Camden after dark on April 26th. By midnight, Steele's entire force was across the Washita and the pontoon bridge was pulled up.
Around 9 o'clock the next morning, the 27th, the Confederates entered the abandoned enemy works at Camden. Kirby Smith was frustrated he couldn't launch an immediate pursuit of the Yankees because he didn't have any way to get across the Washita. Marmaduke's cavalry did swim across the river, but not until that evening. The Confederates didn't begin building a bridge across the Washita until the next morning. And curiously, Kirby Smith also started Maxey's division on its way back to Indian Territory, because he didn't think it would be needed during the pursuit of Steele's column.
Meanwhile, Steele was pushing his men as hard as he could. He chose to take the road to Jenkins Ferry rather than the one to Pine Bluff, so the column could avoid the notorious mud flats of the Morrow Swamp. The road was littered with all manner of equipment and personal belongings the men threw away to lighten their loads and quicken their pace.
A rumor spread up and down the column that the Confederates had got ahead of them and were blocking the road. However, the truth was the rebels were having problems of their own. Fagan couldn't find a place to cross the Saline River after the water level had risen because of heavy rains upstream. He finally gave up and set off toward Arkadelphia on the 29th in search of supplies.
Steele reached Jenkins Ferry that afternoon, and just as Fagan had, he found the high water of the Saline to be a formidable obstacle. But the Federals had their pontoon equipment and in short order had bridged the river. It was after 4 that afternoon, though, before the wagons and artillery started to cross. The infantry and cavalry would cross last. Meanwhile, Marmaduke's Confederate horsemen were pressing closer to Jenkins Ferry.
The rebel cavalry began skirmishing with the Federal rear guard early the next morning, April 30th, trying to pin down the enemy until the Confederate infantry could arrive on the scene. The first rebel foot soldiers to come up were from Churchill's division. The road leading to the river descended from high ground into a narrow gap, bordered on the north by a line of bluffs, a small bayou, and a cane brake. To the south were fields separated by and ringed by timber.
There was little room for either side to maneuver. In the fields close to the river, the Federal infantrymen felled trees to form an irregular abatis and some haphazard breastworks.
The Confederates would have about a quarter-mile of open ground to cover to reach the Federal position. In some places, there was 2 feet of standing water in the fields. Because of the restricted nature of the terrain, a charge across that waterlogged ground and then straight into the abatis and enemy breastworks was the only approach open to the rebels.
Sterling Price ordered Marmaduke and Churchill to assault the Federal position. However, because there was so little room for the Confederates to deploy, their attacks went in piecemeal, mostly just one regiment at a time, moving forward over that bad ground.
Even though there was hardly enough space for the force already committed to the attack, Kirby Smith decided that adding more men would be a good idea, so he ordered Parsons' division to go in also.
Kirby Smith thought he was facing just the Yankee rear guard, which had been left behind on this side of the river, but in reality, Steele hadn't yet started to cross the bulk of his foot soldiers, so the Confederates were actually throwing themselves against most of the Federal infantry, rather than just a weak rear guard.
The Federals poured a withering storm of musket and cannon fire into the Confederate attackers, bloodily repulsing each assault, until finally Churchill and Parsons were forced to give up and pull back. However, by that time, John Walker's division of Texans had arrived on the scene, and Kirby Smith decided to throw it in. He was still thinking, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that he could simply overpower the Federal position here on the near side of the river.
During this last senseless assault by Walker's division, all 3 of his brigade commanders were wounded, Horace Randall and Dirty Shirt Scurry mortally.
Once these last Confederate attacks were defeated and the rebels withdrew, Steele took the opportunity to complete his crossing of the Saline, and after the last of the troops were across the river, the Federals once again pulled up their pontoon bridge and they continued their march toward Little Rock.
Steele kept the column moving throughout the next day, May 1st, and didn't stop at nightfall, but marched through the darkness until 4 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd. After only a short rest, Steele got the column moving again. By that time, all their rations had been consumed, and hunger as well as exhaustion dogged the Federals with each step they took.
However, that afternoon, the head of the column reached Benton, some 25 miles southwest of Little Rock, and there Steele was delighted to encounter supply wagons that had come down the road from the state capitol to meet him as he approached. Rations were distributed as Steele halted at Benton for the remainder of the day.
The next day, May 3rd, Steele reached Little Rock in safety. He feared the Confederates would attack the state capitol, but Kirby Smith, without a pontoon bridge, wasn't able to get across the Saline River, and so wasn't able to pursue the Federals to Little Rock.
Both Kirby Smith and Sterling Price had shown incredibly poor judgment in their tactics at Jenkins Ferry, throwing the lives of their men away in attacks over terrible ground into the teeth of the strong enemy defenses. Out of 6,000 committed to the piecemeal assaults, the Confederates lost between 800 and 1,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing.
In all, Confederate losses during the campaign against Steele were about 2,300 men, while the Federals lost 2,750. In addition, Steele lost over 600 wagons destroyed or captured and 9 artillery pieces.
Having failed to stop Steele from getting away and unable to get across the Saline, Kirby Smith moved his troops back to the little settlement of Tulip near the Jenkins Ferry battlefield. On the night of April 30th, Randall and Scurry died of their wounds and were buried in the village graveyard. For the next couple of days, Smith kept his forces encamped there while he pondered what to do. Then, on May 3rd, he issued orders for the divisions he had brought to Arkansas to march south and return to Louisiana and rejoin Dick Taylor. Having brought those divisions to Arkansas on what turned out to be a wild goose chase, now Kirby Smith could only hope they might arrive back in Louisiana in time to assist Dick Taylor in pursuing and destroying Nathaniel Banks.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is All Cut to Pieces and Gone to Hell, The Civil War, Race Relations, and the Battle of Poison Spring, edited by Mark K. Christ.
Like last episode's book recommendation, this is also a collection of essays edited by Mark Christ. These essays look at what happened on April 18, 1864, at Poison Spring and the massacre of the Black Union soldiers there.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website at www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Noel and Chris W. this past week. Just yesterday, we released members episode number 156, and we hope the members of the Strawfoot Brigade enjoy it. It's a show about Patrick Henry Jones, who was one of a dozen Irishmen who became Union generals during the Civil War.
Besides the newest members, we also want to give a shout out to John W. and Jerome C. for their donations this past week. Then, as always, a big thank you to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.